amazing panel today. We have Maya Giordano, who's the Executive Officer for the Australian Association for Adolescent Health Limited, specialising in youth engagement and child rights. We have Brian Dalton. Sorry, my screen is not cooperating. There we go. He's a HREC member and he's passionate about championing the consumer voice to foster a cultural shift that elevates consumer involvement in health and aged care. We've got Mirella Gazal, Executive Research Manager at the Sydney Local Health District and a member of the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital HREC. Her background spans strategic planning, research, governance, operational management, and compliance with regulatory frameworks. Then we've got Ninyao Yang, who's a public health professional and consumer institute. We have George Kelly, who's the LGBTQIA plus coordinator. Oh, my internet's gone unstable. Can everyone still hear me?
It's been a little bit unstable, but we can hear you now.
What can you say? My slide dropped off. Is it still there?
Can still see slide now not in presenter mode.
Okay.
And just Kate Thompson, if you can hear me, Sarah's inviting you to become a panelist now if you want to accept that invitation.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to deal with the non-presenter mode version. Every time I go to presenter mode, it drops off for some reason. The slides are so nice too. Sorry, I'll crack on to save time. And so I'll just introduce George again. I'm so sorry, George, that I was interrupted. So George Kelly, he's our LGBTQIA plus coordinator from the Melbourne Children's Campus, and he's driving the development of the campus LGBTQIA plus strategy. We've also got Kate Thompson, who's a Gurung and Yagara woman and young board member of the AAAH and lecturer in health and social work at the University of Queensland. We've got David Cook, who's involved with clinical trials development, support and governance, and RPAH HREC acting chair. We've got the famous Janelle Bowden, who is the founder of Access CR and advocate for the consumer voice and research. And Jeff Bass, information technology professional, and he sits as a lay member on the Women and Children's Hospital Human Research Ethics Committee in Adelaide. And I'll just stop sharing that screen so that we can see everybody okay. How does that look for everyone? Sorry, I'm just managing my tech. Okay, so just to set the scene for the discussion. Oh, and sorry, and we've got Sophie Gattenby, who's going to be
manage the chat.
And she's the brains trust behind most of what we have going on today. So Sophie is a research ethics manager at the Royal Children's Hospital. So Sophie, just interrupt any time with anything that we should acknowledge within the chat. So just to set the scene, there's been some concerns raised about the lack of clarity around terminology from the National Statement Update. The key changes are in 2023, two people who bring a broader community and consumer perspective who have no paid affiliation with the institution. That was change number one, and change from 2018 was that, is this right, Sophie, if I'm going about it the right way?
So we've changed from, I think that the term lay member or lay person has changed to community member or someone with consumer experience. So yeah. we thought we'd set the scene there because we knew that that's caused some confusion or some, re-evolution around the role of the community member or the lay person on the HREC.
Thank you, Sophie. That was very well articulated. And so I think that's a really great opportunity to go to Jeff and Brian with their role as HREC members to sort of share their thoughts on this change of layperson to consumer representative, and if they have any opinions on that. So opening up the floor.
I'll kick off if you like, and just say that when I started, yes, I was titled a layperson, but I always thought of myself as a consumer representative on the HREC. So it's probably more just a change in nomenclature, because my role is fundamentally unchanged by being the consumer representative, other than the primary edition of what Morella spoke about that we now look for as part of the ethics review to ensure that there is consumer involvement in the actual research process. Effectively, I'm still looking at protecting the rights, dignity, welfare and safety of the participants and representing their best interests and their expectations. And that, I don't believe, has fundamentally changed. Jeff, I don't know what you think.
Well, you'll find out, Brian.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. It's a thrill to be here. Yeah, look, since you asked the question, I can't say I'm absolutely thrilled by the change in the language. I think it tightens up the specifications for the member, because it does reduce the HREC and the chair of actually picking someone a little bit. But also, I think it puts a role on that member in a way that isn't really put on other member classes. So what they've got here now, because so previously it was pretty loosey-goosey, now it's, essentially you're being asked to bring a broader community or consumer perspective. So that's a particular instruction almost. And then who have no paid affiliation with the institution could mean people who were professionals in another life and who are retired now. And so what you're doing is we're creating a class of lay member who has got to bring in some sort of knowledge about how to do the consumer engagement type work, which is not the job of a lay member from the old days. And someone who is maybe now retired from doing clinical work or academic work is not really, I don't think, in the pure spirit of having a lay member on a HREC. They're still going to see it a certain way. So I'm not thrilled by it. Furthermore, I think this is where they talk about the language being a bit fluffy, because further down it says that no individual may represent more than two categories. But I think the NHMRC here is kind of trying to get a two-for deal going, because they are asking lay members to be consumer, maybe experts or advocates. So they're asking for two roles in one person. And they've also got a thing here which I find hard to parse, because they're asking for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, which could be embodied in the pastoral care member. So they're trying to get two things going in one member. But then further down it says members should not be appointed as members of groups. They're there as individuals. So I think there is a bit of language in all that, where they kind of are colliding a few different ideas together. And I think if you use your imagination, you can see how the next iteration of this is going to be the lay member of old is going to be someone who is really a very serious and even trained and academic consumer advocate and expert, which is a little bit further down the track from just being a lay member.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, Jeff? So I guess the conflict is really around the language, and then what comes from that is confusion about what the purpose of the role is. So with the term layman, it's a representative, that someone from the broader communities there participating in the ethical review of a project. But when we shift towards that terminology around consumer, then that has a different inference, and then does the responsibility fall on that representative to respond to the consumer voices, the expertise of consumers regarding all research projects. When, as we saw from the earlier presentations, there are so many complexities that need to be taken into consideration. I guess how and this is to the broader panel, how should HRECs assess consumer engagement so that it is meaningful and inclusive? Kate, did you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you. I will just first admit that I'm not an expert in the field of human research ethics committees, but I do have some background in culturally safe and responsive practices. So I might respond to that with that in mind. There's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Quality Appraisal Tool, which has been developed by and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and I think this could be a valuable tool that can be used to assist the ethics processes. So it's a tool with a set of 14 questions that appraise the quality of research in Australian settings with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, families and communities. I won't go into it more than that, but this tool can really help us to consider how areas, for example, like how community protocols can be followed and how the research will benefit the community, and several other really important questions to ensure that the research is culturally safe and responsive in its approaches. And I think for that to happen, we really need to have someone on a panel who is deeply connected to culture and or has a deep understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, being and doing.
Thanks, Kate. So I guess if you've got the structure of that tool, it makes that review more robust from the committee because it's there spelled out, ready to go. Marilla, do you have any comments from an operational perspective about that? I mean, I guess you've done some great work capturing that, that process has taken place.
I think, I mean, what I would say is exactly what Brian said, is just, it's what are their roles and how does this space evolve? So I think, as an operations person, as I said at the start of my presentation, it's about listening to the ideas and how do we operationalize that ideas. And, things are very different in different committees. So it's just about responding to that, Maybe David, do you want to add to that?
Well, I actually quite agree with Jeff on this. My vision, my understanding of the original role of the lay members, if I want to call them that, was that they were part of the mechanism by which the HREC represented individual. The community thought about an issue, and that some kind of sensible centre that most people would agree with. And of course, to the extent that you start adding things into the ethics committee, like there's a current campaign to make sure there's always a biostatistician. There are campaigns to make sure there's always a population health expert, a clinical trials expert. You move away from the small core committee that the NHMRC originally envisaged, which is a small group of people who could consult experts and form a view on the basis of their advice. And while I'm really delighted that Brian has helped us so much in the clinic, in the consumer engagement, and of course the way in which managed committees operate, they're delighted to have members develop special expertise. It's probably more important, we actually have mechanisms for engaging people who really know what the issues are and getting their advice on particular issues. So if we think about Indigenous research, actually making sure we have access to people who are really expert in it, who are actually integrated in the appropriate communities, rather than trying to have these large panels of people where the expertise may only be used very occasionally.
Well, it's really important. And so I guess to the broader panel, what experiences have you had of bringing expert consumers into or capturing that assessment by an expert consumer as a part of the HREC assessment? Is that happening commonly so that it doesn't fall on the panel member?
Janelle's got her hand up.
Oh, Janelle, sorry.
That's okay. If it's okay, I wanted to respond a little bit to some of the previous discussion because I think this terminology, and I see the comments in the chat that it's, here nor there. Actually, when we talk about lay or community member versus a consumer versus lived experience, they are quite different things. And then separately, being a consumer engagement professional and understanding how the level of sophistication of consumer engagement a researcher might be presenting in an application. I think they're all very different skills. And I think I'm worried about this scope creep of using the word of consumer to then mean lived experience or consumer engagement professional. And I think David's view that you bring in the people with the expertise at the time that's needed for a specific project is a great approach, but to understand that there are those differences in terminology and they might seem nuanced, but they are quite different.
Excuse me, can I just respond to one of Nell's points? I actually agree that I do not believe the consumers and community representatives are actually the same thing. There are lots of circumstances in our society where community and individual consumers are on very different ends of spectrums. Whether we're talking about wearing seatbelts, or we're talking about smoking in cars, or perhaps Elon Musk's intention to turn himself into a computer eventually. Might be great from his point of view, but I think many in the community have very, very serious concerns about Elon Musk becoming an immortal computer.
Can I just add in, Natasha, just jumping back to your last question around how to assess engagement. I think it's really important if your role is to assess, research ethics applications, that to understand what good practice is, and look at those frameworks and examples. I've got a couple I'll put in the chat for people, but I think we would see that actually applications where consumers or just a different cohort, I guess young people don't always see themselves as consumers. They may just be part of the community. So that term doesn't always apply across the board, but actually just seeing people being engaged across the board of a project, not at the end or not when we're choosing the color of the front of the report, but actually how are they shaping in a meaningful way? And sometimes that meaning is determined by the people. So actually that ongoing cycle of communication and tweaking is really critical. And if you don't know yourself, there's so many experts in consumer youth engagement or just community engagement, and there's a lot of resources out there to really help your group to determine what good practice means.
Thanks, Maya. I think they're all really important points. And I guess the challenge is knowing when genuine engagement has taken place versus tokenism. Has anyone got any tips for HRECs and members who are joining us today for training as to how to assess genuine engagement? What would be sort of the key things that they should be looking for?
Can I offer something?
Yeah.
For me, it's about looking not just that people were engaged, but how that engagement influenced the design or how they're operationalizing that project. Because I think when you start to see that level of detail in describing, we did this with these people, they changed this, we considered these, you know, risks and benefits from their perspective, they provided this feedback, you start to sense that actually there really was engagement, there really was a little bit more depth to just, you know, asking someone who passed you in the corridor down the corner about what they thought.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Marilla?
Right, yeah, I don't know how to raise my hand here. So back to you about operationalizing. I think that's why starting somewhere is really good. So you can actually achieve some kind of baseline. So when we were capturing kind of all the responses for the engagement plans, you know, a lot of the stuff was just like, oh, we're just going to put in whatever they told us to put in on the plans. And look, that was okay. We just wanted to see some genuine effort. But then over time, you know, we started to say, hang on, but when have you done this? Or you said you're going to invite consumers to research meetings at the end of the year. How did that go? Can you know, what was the outcome? And I think we were assessing it like that. So you can kind of see the ones that are genuine and not genuine, and you just start to push them. And sometimes it would be you just have to kind of jump on a meeting and talk to the researchers and say, can you like tell me how you've understood this, and is there any kind of gaps or areas that we can support you with, and just kind of starting to go through that. And that's why it's important, you know, to do your training program. Start anywhere, because there's already so much rich resources out there that you just give some examples. They're like, oh yeah, oh, we're already doing that. So like, how about we kind of build on that and keep, you know. So I think just start somewhere and just continue to capture, you know, what is your baseline and go from there. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt there before I introduce the two people with their hand up? Just pulling on Kate's point before, and I put it in the chat, our HREC actually receive First Nations research and have more than once said, we wish all of our researchers would use this framework in their consultation and research, because that allows them to know that, you know, there's been such good work done prior to HREC, and then they can have a discussion based on the work that's presented. So the framework you mentioned, Kate, completely agree, and that comment's come up a number of times at our HREC meetings. Nyanyol, you were first, and then David.
George and I are in the same room, so there's a interesting setup. However, it's been really great discussion, and I think this conversation around roles, terminology, and scope is really, really important at this point in particular, because I think there's been a lot of evolution in this space, and as we know, our identities are intersectional and non-singular, and as such, so are our lived experiences. And so this conversation about who's a consumer advocate, are those two things the same thing? Can they be different things, is really, really critical. And so I do agree with a lot of the panel discussion about, you know, kind of distinguishing what that is and what's the scope of practice there. I think when we talk about tokenism, it's really important to kind of go back to basics, like who can actually define what is tokenistic? And I think that's oftentimes a conversation you have with people, you know, on the receiving end. I don't know if we can, you know, at a very, you know, distance from the population we're seeking to engage with, say this is tokenistic, this is not tokenistic, without having a conversation. I think that HRECs have an important role to encourage research efforts that encourage consumer involvement throughout the whole process. I think HRECs also have a really important position and role to encourage research that is meaningful, consumer involvement that's meaningful, and what that means for that particular context. I think a lot of researchers often will kind of aim for co-design, co-production. You know, folks who have seen our team present will see the slide that we're in the era of the co. However, sometimes it's more meaningful for consumers to kind of do something that's a bit more kind of informed, you know, just sharing information, sharing ideas, and doing that well, instead of kind of committing yourself to doing co-design when that's not feasible for the time you have and the resources that you have. You can't follow through on the commitment you've made to the consumers. It's hard to manage expectations. So kind of having really open discussions with everyone, including researchers and HREC members, about what's actually feasible for that particular research project, I think is important in the name of avoiding tokenism.
Yeah. Well, that's very well articulated. Thank you. David, did you have something to add? Sorry, David, you're just on mute.
Just a couple of stories. When Morella and Brian first started really pressing researchers to pay attention to consumers, we got a lot of pushback from the big research groups who dealt with big pharma, who said there's no way in the world big pharma's going to pay attention to us. And it all looked pretty hopeless for about 8 months. And then one day I received an email from a drug company, which I'm happy to name, BMS, saying, please look at this protocol amendment. It's we've got a consumer advisory panel. It wants to change the protocol and it's changed the information sheets. And I thought, well, if BMS is doing this, we're actually on something that's actually going to work. And the other thing which I find, the other two stories really, is on a couple of occasions I've actually been involved in discussing future clinical trials with clinical trial groups. And on a number of those occasions, they've actually involved patient and consumer groups who are actually part of the process, and it was great fun. You know, getting insights about what the key issues are for women having induction of labour from a group of committed women who actually want to talk about what the outcome should be and things like that was enormously helpful. And I guess the final story I'd like to share is that and I've forgotten, which is good. Okay.
Maybe we can come back to it, David. Just when
Okay.
you think of it, pop your hand up. Brian, did you want to add something further?
Yes, thank you. I just also wanted to say that, and this could be another whole panel discussion, that I've sat on a research grant funding organisation that was also looking for evaluating the consumer input to the study, the end-to-end consumer input, as part of the granting process. So it's not just HRECs that are tackling this. As institutions, it's also some of the grant funders, if not all, are starting to look for this as well. So it's something that we need to join because it's already left the station, and whilst it may not be right, it's heading in the right direction.
Starting. Thanks, Brian. David, have you remembered what you said?
I have indeed, Sophie. Sorry about forgetting
Yes.
it, but it was actually a follow-up to the comments about co-design. My own experience is that on ethics committees, that co-design actually creates problems for applicants, because if you put in an application saying we're going to co-design a protocol or a study, the committee can say, well, look, that's great, but what are we actually going to approve at the end? What will we approve at the end of the co-design process? So we actually have to put in two applications. And I actually do wonder whether you actually do need to put an ethics application for a co-design process. You know, these are grown people who are turning up, or presumably grown people, may not be. People are turning up, participating in a highly intensive activity that they could simply walk out of. So should that really be covered by an ethics process?
Yes, that's a really interesting point, David. That came up. I was at a meeting where Tricia Greenhalgh from the UK was there, and that also came up as a point. And she mentioned she'd published a paper on that out of her continuing frustrations of inconsistencies with ethics committees. Mm-hmm. And so her assertion was, no, you co-design and then put the research study to the ethics committee. The co-design of the protocol is part of the story of developing the research that's about to be reviewed. So that was her position. Yeah, it's a very good point. Janelle, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to say something similar, that I don't think there is this scope creep around involvement activities theoretically becoming under the purview of ethics committees, and I don't think we should go down that path, because we can have conversations. There is a paper, and I'm just looking for the link. I'll try and put it into the chat, around a framework for deciding whether or not something should go to an ethics process. And there's this weird middle ground where we want people to report on their involvement activities. By doing so, it becomes a research project that theoretically needs ethics approval. I think we need to get away from that thinking if we have, to David's point, mature people who have consented to be part of a process and who want to share what they did and the outcomes of that. I think we have to be careful about wanting ethics approval for that.
Thanks.
Can I hop in there? Do you mind if I hop in?
Yes, Jen.
I can't raise my hand. I don't know what's going on. I'm the
That's
IT.
right. Just wave at me and I'll, yeah. Good.
Look, just following on from Janelle, actually, I had this idea in my head that, this is an ethics committee, so we're a bit like a hammer to the nail. We're just seeing everything as being a thing for HREC to solve. I think, research is a continuum. It's a stack of things, and so there's always an argument in ethics about why is the ethics committee reviewing the information sheet, or why are we critiquing the grammar? Why are we commenting on sample size? Sample size. Why are we commenting on scientific method? These are not your problems. And people were talking about that earlier. That HRECs, should we be looking at scientific value because it's already been assessed? Well, yeah, we have to, because it's the whole point of being ethical. And so things like, and I've advocated for having a data management plan in with the application bundle for ethics, but you could argue that's a governance thing or an institutional thing, perhaps. So all this stuff does happen in a big stack of processes, and it starts with someone having an idea and ends up in ethics. And in the meantime, you have the institution or the department approves it, it gets scientifically validated, it gets a grant approval. A lot of the grant approval processes now have very robust methods around examining consumer involvement. So it might actually be that we're sitting here talking about ethics and we kind of want everything to pile into ethics. But I think at the same time, we've got to understand that a lot of this work gets done downstream. And so we might think, well, how do we, if a HREC is interested in consumer engagement, are we going to trust that it happened when it went through the grant process or the institutional process? So
Yeah,
that's a
they're all
question.
really good points, Jeff. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we can't, I think, sort of to Janelle's thing about scope creep, I think kind of we have to be careful on HRECs about just wanting to do everything and check everything all the time.
Yeah. Janelle, were you next with your hand up? No? David?
Well, I just thought it was a good moment a few seconds ago, or a few minutes ago, to just mention what I think was one of Rob Loblow's great innovations, which is the letter, no ethical objection letter. So when people had done some quality control or quality improvement work, and they decided they wanted to publish it, his view was it couldn't go to an ESCI and for ethical approval because it had already been done. So issuing a letter saying that the ethics committee had no ethical concerns about a project, if that was appropriate, was a great way of allowing them to publish it without undue interference from the ethics committee.
That's really interesting. Marilla, I saw your hand go up.
I just want to add, obviously, I always give an operational perspective. But as Brian was saying, again, just looking at what your committee needs. And obviously, you need to be able to ensure that the HREC is not taking on the whole load. Ethics committees, as they're the approving authority, they're the ones that are meant to see everything and do everything. But they really do need to be supported by institutional processes and obviously from the community. So it's really important to ensure that there is when we have a research centre, support service, that we do all the strategic planning at that level to really support the whole research process. Because as Jeff was saying, there's a lot of burden and responsibilities on HRECs to do things. But it's really a continuum. It's a whole of community approach. And it's great that the grant bodies are coming on board, which has really kind of advanced this space. But, for about 10 years ago, the concept of having consumer engagement in the applications was a foreign thought. We've made a lot of great progress. And I think that having those conversations about where the role sits and moving forward is only going to, in the next 5 years, we're going to see some great developments as well. And I mean, the things that we've just implemented recently is having a prem-specific feedback process on the information sheets. So, which should be an extension of the complaints paragraph. We should be hearing what our patients or our participants are experiencing before it becomes a complaint, and then we can also assess how genuine that consumer engagement process has been. And so we've introduced that. We've already got a few participants very eager to tell us, how what their experience has been so far in the actual study. So I would just say that it's a conversation to continue, and we can just need to keep, help with supporting each other in this space.
Yeah, it's interesting, that broader lens of consumer and community engagement by getting that ongoing feedback and assessment of people's experiences of participating in research. I was just wanted to ask a question of George, if I could, and I know you're in the room with me now, but how do you think a HREC could assess inclusion and also intersectionality, whether or not that's been considered within a project?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I have two responses to that. One would be ensuring lived experience is included at every stage, and by that I'm meaning lived experience of people with diverse experiences with any group, not just projects that relate specifically to diversity. If we look at a project that involves women, there'll be a small minority of people who don't also have another diverse experience, at least one on top of that. But I think it's really important to consider how intersectionality has been considered, not just whether it's been considered. And there's so many reasons for that. If you kind of haven't looked at how safety's been established in a group, you can end up with research results that are quite normative and don't actually reflect people's experiences because they might not feel comfortable or encouraged to share these. We can also look at how diversity groups are defined and grouped together, and sometimes that can skew research or prevent people from participating. And an example I just saw yesterday was grouping the sexual health of boys and male identified people, and then grouping sexual health of girls and female identified people when looking at adolescence. And this is an attempt to be inclusive, but it's actually, if you haven't considered what's being asked, you've essentially potentially just grouped people with entirely different body parts together that might have completely different sexual health advice. Another consideration is looking at whether the researcher has, or the research project has, considered ethics guidance that are specific to those two diversity groups. And Kate brought up a good example of guidelines related to Aboriginal communities. There's also different ethics considerations when you look at gender and sexually diverse communities as well, and there's available guidelines there. And I really like the points everyone has made about, I guess, distancing the responsibility of the HREC to kind of have diverse representation on every single topic, because it is impossible. And we really need to make sure that we're reaching out to experts and relying on guidelines that exist. If my role is the LGBTIQA plus coordinator, I can't, even within that subgroup, there is so much diversity and completely different experiences there, and a requirement to constantly be going out and consulting. I'll leave it there for now, in case anyone has anything else to add.
Thanks, George. That's really great. Thank you. I just wanted to also broaden the question a bit to Maya and Kate. How can we consider inclusion and intersectionality for young people and children as well?
I guess, yeah, I mean, like George said, they're not a homogenous group. And I think recognizing that diversity, also seeing young people as experts in their own experience. And I suppose we see that there's a lack of representation of young people on in those ethics processes, whether it's on the committee. But I think working with the relevant cohort of young people to understand their unique needs and how they would like to be involved, I think is really key. Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not at this stage. If I think of something, I will. Thank you.
Right.
George,
Did
your
you
hand
have
is up.
anything? Oh, George, sorry, George.
Oh yeah, just wanted to add just an example illustrating that is yeah, the intersection of young people and other diverse identities can impact so many things. And one example is young people who, for example, have any kind of gender diversity or diversity of sexual orientation, where when we're working with young people, we need to get guardian consent, but that can put certain young people in danger or prevent them from participating if they don't have supportive guardians. So that's a kind of example of a consideration that needs to be modified.
Bessie brought that up as well. It's a really important point. Thanks, George.
Just add, Natasha. I think it's worth thinking about assuming intersectionality. So, you know, it might be sexual health or it might be on any topic, but is the research still asking, you know, gender and sexuality diverse questions that align with the ABS gold standard? Are they asking appropriate questions about Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin? Because what we're finding is often, unless the research is specific to a cohort, chronically ill young people, you could list all of these different groups, and often our demographic section does seem like incredibly long, but I guess the value of that is that it means that that group is captured and understood, and ultimately research informs policy and practice. So if we're not asking those questions that capture intersectional identities and experiences, then we're just missing a piece of the pie when it comes to research and findings on really important topics for a range of people.
And I guess I know we're running out of time, Sophie. I just wanted to add, I think it's important for researchers to share these types of learnings when they are reporting the results of their research, also sharing the learnings from a regulatory review, considerations for other researchers that want to do similar work, so that we're constantly learning and getting more precision in how we're going about our business. Now, we've got 1 minute left. Sophie, did you want to add anything that from what you've seen in the chat briefly? You've been doing an amazing job.
I've been trying to respond to
it.
things, and lots of people have shared some really good resources. One of the points that I would make as a HREC manager is, I mean, our job is to be asking questions and asking for the evidence that we need, and even down to asking people how we should be asking the questions. So I think it's not just around saying, oh, we need to get this information, but how do we ask the question in the right way to make sure that we're asking the right question, if that makes sense. I've kind of said questions a few times, but I mean, there are people out there who have these expertise. They do have, you know, there are people out there, people on this panel who are working to make systems changes at their institutions. And I almost think one of the roles of the HREC is to push back when things aren't done. And an example I'll give is constantly getting applications where ICFs have not been translated or have not been made accessible to a variety of groups. And I think it's our role as a HREC to really push back. And they say, we don't have the resources to do this. We don't have the resources to do that. We can't always solve that problem, but we always push back no matter what, even if we sound like a broken record. And then we also say to them, if this is a feasibility or a pilot study, when you come to doing the actual trial, you make sure you come with funding to do this, because what you're doing is not representative of an intersectional population or in the whole population. So I think the HREC has a role in continually asking the questions in order to get that improvement. That's all I would say. And I think that sort of matches things that were going on in the chat.
No, I just jump on that. There'd have to be a commensurate increase in funding from upstream, wouldn't there? Because if you're doing a focus group with 10 people, you're going to get saturated pretty quick, but you're not going to get a lot of subtle detail on the edges. So if you want the subtle detail on the edges, you're going to need 50 people. And now it's a much bigger study. So there's got to be some tolerance upstream for a lot more money flowing into quite small studies.
And I think that's why the institutions that HRECs represent have a role to try and streamline those things so that there's a sharing of those resources to improve communication and access. And I think I would say I work in an institution where we're trying to do that, and I feel very lucky. But also the grant bodies have, mandated consumer engagement. And I think my point was, you go back, you say, the HREC says, once you come to the full study, make sure that you've got the resources. So that's sort of saying to them, when you go to get your grant, make sure you're writing this in, that you need this funding to make sure that you're representing a broader group in the community.
We could keep talking all afternoon, but unfortunately we're going to have to close the session. And I don't know, but there's lots and lots of resources in the chat. Anyway, we've run out of time, unfortunately. I just wanted